Hello and welcome to Taking Liberties Radio, Season 6, Episode 20. My name is Lee, I'm in WA, joined by Vickers and Zeev over on the East Coast, which apparently is being snowed under, or frozen to death, or some other kind of natural calamities. So I hear.
Well, not really.
Okay.
Hi
just
there.
like, okay.
But
I
yeah,
was just like, it's a little bit nippy
that's
there, but I don't know what they're talking about.
yeah, it's like strong winds overnight sometimes, and it's a little chilly in the daytime. But
It
we're
doesn't get
getting
like
by.
that in WA. If it gets down to like 10 degrees, we're like, we're freezing to death. So, you know.
It's -2 tonight here.
Oh,
So.
Jesus. I don't think it's
In sunny Canberra. Wow, how do you get
I
by?
suppose theoretically it's been minus.
We burn tax dollars.
Yeah, that's
It's all the soul,
in your fireplace.
all the soul energy being
Makes-
drained
it
away
makes
from
so
all the
much
residents. Yeah.
so energy efficient.
It's the Dementors that they send
Well,
out.
well, funnily enough, after a feasibility study, we found burning cash is actually cheaper than a wind farm subsidy.
Basically,
It probably is.
They
Okay.
just put a generator in Keynes's grave and just like start burning the money, and then he just gets excited.
Okay.
All right, this week we're going to talk about not Keynes's grave. In fact, we're going to talk about the High Court ruling in a case saying that someone working with the Australian Public Service was properly fired, or fired according to the rules
Appropriately.
for tweeting her dissent against government policy. And we're also going to talk about superannuation increases, mandatory superannuation increases. So let's start off with the case of Michaelia Banerjee. I'm going to say that's how you say it. I think that's how you say it. Michaelia Banerjee.
Yeah.
Who was this week found... Yes, so she basically appealed to the High Court. She was fired back in 2013 for running a anonymous Twitter blog, I guess, where she was critical of government policy. She worked for the Department of Immigration and was fired, and then she's just appealed and also applied for compensation, and all of that was denied.
Yeah, so, I mean, I can only go by sort of Canberra history here. I don't think this is anything new. So, like, the quintessential example was Grog's Gamut. For anyone who doesn't know, Greg Jericho, who was let go from the public service back in 2010, I think. Is it 2010 or 2011?
Doesn't he write for The Guardian now?
He does. But he used to be...
fellow?
Yeah, he is the same fella. Yeah, he got outed by a news journalist, News Limited journalist, Masola, if I remember correctly.
Right.
Yeah, so I've brought this up several times. That guy was let go for pretty much the same thing. Now, the public policy for the Australian Public Service is that it's not that you're not allowed to comment on government policy on your social feed. That's not accurate. What you're not allowed to do is basically talk about an area you're working in, and basically criticize the government's policy on that based on stuff you know. Because the idea is basically you are undermining the government's position or something like that. There's
in the specific department you're in.
Yeah. And it's got to do with basically you're undermining the government's, because the government is the one that ultimately makes the decision in your department. So it undermines the government's position, blah, 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 blah. There's a very long-winded explanation the public certainly can give you about that. But my understanding is this woman fell in line with previous rulings on it. The only difference now is the High Court has ruled on it as opposed to federal court.
So, I mean, maybe we should start off talking about the actual kind of principle that underlies this policy, which is essentially that the independence and impartiality of the public service needs to be protected. And so I guess the key justification for this sort of thing is that if you let people in their departments comment publicly on what the government is doing, it threatens that
it's so cute that we believe. It's so cute that we believe.
I know, and this is the thing.
The public service.
So it's I don't think anybody actually really believes that. Well, okay. Maybe nobody.
The public service is not neutral, but it does mostly obey the orders of the minister in charge.
Yes.
I mean...
Yeah, well, yes. So here's the thing. People often say, like, the government has a left-wing bias. Sorry, the public service has a left-wing bias. And to a certain degree, that's true because they are pro-union. But the actual bias of the public service, there's a quote: "The bureaucracy grows to meet the expanding needs of the bureaucracy."
Yes, yeah.
They are just.
I mean, something we have talked about previously a lot, and because we talk about public choice theory, which deals with that.
Yeah.
Go on, Lucas. Sorry.
Yeah, so their bias is to increasing the size of the bureaucracy, which happens to be mainly a left-wing thing, but it's not as if the right wing is immune to it. The right wing has its areas where they want to grow the bureaucracy, but the one that really likes to grow the bureaucracy tends to be the left wing. So I understand why people can make that mistake. But yes, the public service is not impartial. It is definitely partial to growing itself.
Sure.
And I mean, take from that as you will. So in that sense, I don't think, I mean, Ziv can correct me if I'm wrong here, I don't think anything's changed by this High Court ruling.
Look, what I think has changed, first of all, is that there's been a constitutional argument about the issue. I don't remember there being a constitutional argument about this issue before. Certainly people have been let go before for breaching the Public Service Act and the principles of the public service, the APS values, absolutely. But I think I cannot remember the first time, any other occasion on which a public servant has run the argument that their dismissal infringes on the Constitution because it undermines their right to free expression. So that's what I would say to that. And I think the point to bear in mind is that Australia does not have First Amendment. It does not have a right to free speech in the sense that the Americans do. What we have is what the High Court calls a right to...
Political communication was the phrase they used.
Yeah,
and they specifically said we don't have freedom of speech.
Correct. Yeah. We have an implied right to political communication because that's necessary to keep our liberal democracy going, so to speak. And in all likelihood, that implied right did not really exist. It was dreamt up in the 90s by some High Court judges who felt that it was unfair to rule against a particular person who felt as if their right to free expression was being infringed upon. My own perspective is, yeah, that's right, but better that than nothing, I suppose.
Yeah.
And I guess in this scenario, both parties in the court conceded that the right to free expression was being infringed upon by the APS values and the Public Service Act. So there was actually no debate that being an employee of the Commonwealth means that if the APS values are taken seriously, it means that you can't talk about the things in your department. And that absolutely is, it means that for an APS public service, officer, or for anyone in the federal or state or local government employment arrangement, and that's about 2 million people, so almost 10% of the population, if I understand correctly.
Yep.
I mean, less, but close to that number. They can't actually talk about their employment openly, even though the conditions of their employment are obviously something that affects Australians more broadly because it's the government that they vote for and supposedly to which they, expect accountability, from which they expect accountability.
I would like to get back to the question I asked before about the impartiality, but just to go with just that comment you made there, that is not unusual though in the private sector. So if I was to ask, you're a lawyer, if I asked you to comment on a case you're currently working on, you would be like, I can't comment.
That's absolutely
right. If I was Lucas about his work, he wouldn't be able to comment. So correct. That's not strictly unusual that like matters of current sort of ongoings, in a workplace is something that the employees cannot comment on.
That's right. But the thing is, once you expand the workforce, how is this different? I think one major thing to think about is that these people are not part of the ordinary private sector workforce. They're part of the public workforce, and they are 10% of the population. It's not 1%. It's not a few hundred people.
Yeah.
It's 10% of the population that cannot speak to the goings on of this country within their particular area
Sure.
to the public. And
so just to counterpoint that,
yes,
so Michaela Banerjee, she couldn't comment on immigration. She could comment on economics. She could comment, like on the budget. There's a lot of government to talk about that is not.
It's actually so it's not actually. Hang on. It's not actually the case that she couldn't comment on immigration. What she couldn't comment on was immigration policy. Like, what she was doing was basically
like if she said
saying,
close the detention centers, that would be wrong.
Yeah,
That's a matter of kind of policy.
yeah,
But if
exactly.
She said, immigration should be like this. We should have open borders. That would be fine.
Yeah, exactly.
Well,
so, sort of. I don't know exactly. So what she actually lost her job over was pretty much doing something similar to what Greg Jericho and other people like that have done before, which is take areas that they've worked on and where the government went and decided something and went, no, if they had done what I said, or done what this alternative one was, and it just happened to be something that they were working on. And obviously the opposition went and ran with that. So the idea behind that is basically, so the point is basically she's undercutting her minister through public sphere or something like that.
Well, it's certainly treading on some risky territory to voice opposition to the policies that you are entrusted with enforcing, and it is certainly the case that this lady criticised immigration policy, and it is certainly the case that led to her dismissal.
Yeah.
So,
and she's also just, I think, generally critical of the government. So, in a particular news article I'm looking at on the ABC website, it embeds one of her tweets where she's like, after the lies about 9/11 in Iraq, why would anybody give credence to anything said by those who have their own immoral agenda? So, interesting. This is 2012, so this is during the Gillard government.
Gillard years, yeah. So this isn't like she's attacking a liberal minister. She's attacking just anyone. Like, to be perfectly honest, these this is actually one of the problems with the public service. Like, the public service's job security framework and all of this stuff means like it's really hard to get rid of these people, and they kind of sit there and fester. And it's actually really bad. While people talk about the job security in the government is absolutely necessary, because otherwise, when the government changes, they just go through and fire all the public servants that disagree with them politically. The alternative is this: you get people that sit there in these enforcement roles and fester and and then just come out violent. And just come out in a very unprofessional manner. It's bad for the country. Like, okay. So this is where I do get a little bit conservative. My preference is, a very minimal, anarchy, right? Effectively, like, you pay for the services you need, or like the services are provided by civil society. If we're going to have a government, I'd prefer it to be run efficiently, instead of these overtures and principles to going, we want to have, we want to have this thing that, workers collective in this. So we want to have a workers' collective in this public service or something like that. I'd rather have an efficient public service that answers to someone and gives accountability up the chain, rather than this nonsense.
That's what happened in this case. I mean, by the logic of the rules, if you want efficient government supervision, you essentially need to have a government that can do its thing and be judged by the voters and not judged by the departments. So, I started off thinking this is about, I would like to see more speech from public servants. I think I'm probably more unsure now, just because I think, do you really want to empower a bunch of people who have no accountability to anybody to just kind of freely do whatever the hell they want?
No, and that's my point. I'm totally happy with public servants having very strict conditions.
But I guess the counterpoint would be, so this kind of goes back to what I initially asked you, which was, okay, we have this fiction that these departments are impartial, providing impartial advice. The alternative would be back what it used to be back in kind of the 1800s in England and the US, where it was essentially all of these were the sinecures. They were basically all politically appointed roles. I mean, obviously government got a lot bigger. You cannot have they didn't need the bureaucracy they have now back then. But basically all of these were political appointments. The entire department would change whenever you change a minister. Would that actually provide for better, more efficient government provision if essentially the entire department's politicized? Because I think that's the counterpoint. Like if you say, okay,
I think there's a massive assumption that departments aren't politicized right now.
No. So I think there's a difference between having public choice type issues where there's incentive problems and principal agent problems and all that kind of stuff, and it's a whole other ball game when it's explicitly political. Like we're essentially.
I prefer it explicitly.
Okay.
Well, I prefer it
explain it.
It's more that there's points to be made by both of you there, and you're both making fair points. I think partly what I would say is to a great extent, this debate wouldn't matter if there were only a few public servants, so to speak.
Of course, yeah.
And to me, the issue, the reason this is of national concern, and the reason this has gone out so widely is because it affects 10 million people.
Yeah.
And 2 million people, and with those 2 million people, they're broader families and communities. To me, that's the real concern, so to speak, that, people's employment is, if they choose to speak out on their department's issues, it's at risk because it affects so many people. I guess it effectively means that a lot of the population don't have the right to free speech on that particular subject. Now, I accept that, employment is a special situation, but certainly when you're dealing with the public service, it's not an employer that I would regard as a private sector employer, and I don't think that the same rules apply in that way.
Okay, but you can look at the other branch of national service, which is the military, and the military definitely does not have freedom of speech at all.
Mm.
Absolutely none, and we've always operated under that banner for the military services. So I don't think that's a big issue. And if you take a look at it, even countries with hyper-militaristic structures like the United States, where I think they've got 1 in 20 people now basically doing something for the military. So it's 5% of the population, effectively don't have freedom of speech, but they live and work under those conditions. So I don't think it's as much of an issue.
Though I would say that's part of the problem of having such a big military.
Yeah,
that's what I'm saying. I'm not making a judgment call either way on the issues that you've raised, because there's a fair perspective for each of them. The government should have loyal employees or not, but actually, what we should be saying, I'm suggesting, is the government should have fewer employees. And all of its moral issue would be way less severe.
I think we need a button for this show, which I press, and on the screen or in the audio appears a thing saying, just make government smaller, because that's kind of a thing. All of these problems would be fixed if you had less government. So yeah, of course, that is absolutely the fair point, and I imagine we would get to that point eventually. But I mean, that's probably not going to happen tomorrow. Where if you change social media, you can change the social media guidelines tomorrow. I think there is just trade-offs. There is no better policy because by having more free communication, what you also allow is more for effectively what we would call whistleblowers. So,
that would be my leaning as well.
Yeah.
I think.
So that's a benefit. We want more people inside government and revealing to us the nature of the workings of government so that we can judge it more fairly, because ministers are not going to be like, oh, here are all these small businesses that the ATO has just audited completely unfairly. Sorry guys, they're not gonna have that press conference. You need people within the system to be like, oh, the system is shitty. Let me show you why.
Yeah, and I think...
And in fact, that's what happened recently, and the guy got fired and charged for leaking that information. So, anyway, sorry, Vickers, go on.
Yeah, well, that was a slightly different thing, because he also used his discretionary powers to put wiretaps and all sorts of other things. So that's what he's being charged with.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, yeah. I suspect if you had a broad, some sort of freedom of speech clause within the public service, the Australian Public Service guidelines.
So
some of those things would be allowed to come on board, but yeah.
So we actually do have cover. So as far as the world is concerned, we have a much better mechanism, and it's actually I probably have to go look up the articles, but it's been abused a number of times. But we have something called the Public Information Disclosure Act of 2013, which is something that was passed by the Gillard government, which is actually great. It's probably world leading in terms of protections for whistleblowers. But even with that, it doesn't give a carte blanche provision protection.
No.
And like, to be perfectly honest, it tends to swing towards protecting public service. There was a recent case, I have to go look it up, but basically where a cop tried to use it to protect some illegal accessing that he'd done on an ex.
Yeah.
So he tried to use the act to protect himself there, and then they went, whoa, no,
Yeah.
no.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, we do have an act in place. It's pretty good. It's not perfect, but I'd say we probably have more protections for whistleblowers rather than less.
Sure.
In terms of in the grand scheme of countries.
It's worth mentioning that we actually talked about this on a previous issue of the podcast, so I might put a link up to that in the show notes, saying if you want to go back to our discussion on the specific case of the guy in the ATO, that is available. Let's move on. We've got another sort of 10 minutes to go. Let's talk about the other thing, which is a superannuation. This is why I have notes in front of me, so I remember these things. So the current policy is that the compulsory superannuation rate, that is the amount of money that the government forces your employer to set aside for your super, is going to go from 9.5% to 12%. And
disgusting.
Okay.
No, So I've referred to compulsory superannuation as effectively private taxation, right?
Yes.
So instead of you getting your pay packet, you're basically getting 9% less of your pay packet. And I know some people go like, oh no, I get my pay packet plus super, and I sit there going like, mate, any way you look at it, any way you splice this, right? Everyone has a total packet, right? Even if they go, here's your pay packet plus super, right? And they go like, oh, that's the employer contribution. It's like, it's just accounting. That's what's happening, right? At the end of the day, it would have been that plus your 15% would have been your full salary. So it's a form of taxation, but private taxation forced into companies which the government has made special dealings with. Look, I could have backed compulsory super as a policy if they said everyone born after 1972 does not get the pension.
Yep.
Right? That's the only scenario in which that would have worked. But that's not what they've done. So right now there's a shit ton of our money going into like super funds effectively. And look, if you're in your like a large number of people in their 20s go from job to job, right? Because they're getting all this casual work, and it's like sitting in a whole bunch of these. There's all these tiny accounts that are sitting in a whole bunch of like funds like Rest or wherever else retail funds go into, and they kind of just sit there and evaporate due to fees until they hit their minimum amount. And then after 7 years, they get collapsed into the government's revenue. So it's just. I look at it and go like, there is so much money here being pissed away that people probably don't know that they have, and that's why we've got all this. And that's why we've got these services that go like, find my super, because people don't know about that super account they set up when they were 17.
Especially like so. This is relevant to me because when back when I first started working, you didn't get a choice necessarily in where you super went. So I basically had a bunch of different jobs, which meant I had a bunch of different super accounts. And over a period of 15 years, you lose track of them because, I'm like, now I'm getting a bit older. I'm in my 30s. I'm like, oh, this is actually my money. I should track it down. And so, you have those sorts of issues.
Super is fantastic. Like I'm a professional. Like I'm a professional worker. I make same like Zeev, right? Like we're probably in professions that get paid that get appropriately remunerated. Let's say. Right? So super is a fantastic policy for people like us. And, in the past, that's exactly what was happening. To attract these urban professionals, they were going like, we'll give you super. We'll do an employment contribution so that, you've got some retirement money set aside. Makes perfect sense for people like us because it's like, oh, okay, you're kicking in a little bit of extra money. You're taking 10% out of my total package, right? Even though it's an employer contribution, it's still 10% out of the total package. And it's going into a nice fund that's generating. It's like someone giving me a nice retirement package.
Sure.
Great, because I'm not going to miss it, right? I'm getting paid enough that You know, it's such a small chunk.
Yeah.
However, like casual workers, right? Or or people on
Part-time
low income.
students. You have students who have a
Yeah,
part-time
part-time
job like this
students.
guy.
Yeah,
15% of my income is a lot of money.
Yeah, people who switch jobs often. What else? Like temp workers, right? So they have to fill out that form every time they go to a new place. It goes into a different fund. Who knows, right? So
Foreign students.
Foreign students. Forget about foreign students. They have to spend so much paperwork to get the money out. Yeah, so these people just have funds sitting in all these Australian funds, fund organisations, and they're just being ripped off.
Unfortunately. And there'll be more rip-offs to come if the rate goes up, I guess. So what are the arguments for super, guys? Well, let's hear them out for a moment.
Sure.
So, why should the rate go up?
I think the original proposal, so this really comes from the Keating government back in the early 90s. Essentially, the principle was, if we force people to save money, they won't need the pension. So, and I think, and I'm pretty sure we had a discussion about this particular topic back early February last year. We had a discussion about this entire subject, and I'm sure we covered this territory before as well. I mean, I think the idea that you should try to get people off the pension is a good idea. I just think this is the wrong policy to do it. So I think, I would say, and maybe you guys would agree, that the way you don't have dependence on the pension is by not creating the problem in the first place. So like having the existence of the pension encourages people who are likely to not save for their retirement because they'll think, I'll just deal with that later. Where if the prospect of destitution is there, they'll be like, oh, I need to do something about this. So the existence of the pension creates incentives for the pension to continue to exist. The argument is saying people should starve to death once they stop working, or they should work till they die. And libertarians generally have a bit of an issue persuading people of that kind of thing. So
what I find interesting as well, and I think deserves mention, is that the Grattan Institute, which is an institute founded by funding from the Australian Labor Party about a decade ago, if memory serves, the Grattan Institute has put out a paper and a lot of media coverage around it to say that the increase from compulsory super from 9.5% of wages to 12% would, quote, leave many Australian workers poorer over their entire lifetimes, end quote. So we have an interesting scenario, I think, in which the Grattan Institute is actively arguing against a clear Labor Party policy that is a little unusual, I think, and unexpected, because it's not as if the Grattan Institute they're very middle of the road. They're actually, pro free markets in some respects, but they're actually pro bigger government spending and so on in other respects. It's very strange to see them oppose this measure. Go on.
One of the issues is that, like, this income that is diverted to super funds is diverted to, like, it could be, younger workers could invest in things that are more risky and make a bigger return. So that's one of the issues of having this system, is essentially this income that you could use to buy a house or to invest in something else is siphoned away into this arcane system that you have basically no control of. And so essentially
you've got some control.
Very little. I mean, because basically
not very few, but many people don't understand super well enough to control it properly.
Sure.
And certainly, for a lot of people, putting their life savings into a superannuation fund, it's basically playing with the stock market, which people are never really comfortable doing with their own money in the first place.
Sure. But I mean, I think one of the issues is you don't even get a choice in how it's invested in the stock market. So, if we had access to that money, you could invest it yourself in something that generates a higher return or has more risk or has less risk, for that matter.
Well, if you've got over 100k assets, you can set up your own super fund and do it yourself and make those investment decisions. But once you can do it at any asset point, really, but only at over 100k, my understanding is when it makes financial sense
Yeah, I mean, basically, if you do SMSF below 100K, you'll just lose it all out to fees.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you have to account. I think SMSF you have to account for roughly $1,700 worth of fees off the top of my head per year. So yeah, I mean, if you're making decent interest on 100K, that you can probably still grow at that one. Still grow at that rate. But yeah. So, but look, most people don't have the time or attention to play SMSF games.
Correct.
Most people don't have the time or attention to play on the stock market.
Yep.
So the entire argument just that people can really take care of their retirement doesn't make much sense. That's why you've got these funds. But my point is,
especially for tradies and the like. I mean, they could just be entrepreneurs. Develop, build properties, make a massive amount of money. Instead, some of their pay goes into super.
Yeah,
it doesn't make sense anyway.
So my super is doing fairly well. But I mean, I've got friends who basically do play stock market games and stuff like that, and they've pointed out that their super would be significantly some of their supers would be performing better if they just sat them in Vanguard funds.
Yeah.
So
and that's the reality, right? That's the reality.
I think you can do that as well in a super account. You can just put it in a Vanguard index fund. Vanguard is the index fund, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, it's the index fund.
So, I guess for people playing at home, an index fund is a fund which basically follows the stock market, so to speak. If the stock market goes up, the fund goes up. Yep. And there are no active decision. Yeah, the investment decisions there's no active decision making.
Yeah. They just buy financial advice. If it's an ASX 200 fund, it just buys the top 200 shares in the top 200 funds. And so really, the only thing that's monitored is which funds come out of the top 200, which funds go in the top 200, and that's it.
So pretty much. And in that way, eventually, because there's no financial advice or financial manager of the account, there's less fee. For the index beat the managed accounts in that way. That's the argument.
Yeah, sure. So if you go to it, wow, yeah, you really should put it in a Vanguard fund. So if you put it in a Vanguard fund,
that's what I've read.
Yeah, if you put it into a Vanguard fund this year, you would have gotten 22.87%. If you put it into an industry super fund, you would have gotten 9%.
Yeah.
Wow.
And if you put it into a retail, it's about 7%.
Yeah.
So that gives you an idea. Vanguard funds
over a period of a long time, because I mean, this is essentially what this is. It's a long-term investment. Yeah, the difference between 20% and 7% in the long term is a huge.
It's just been a really good year. That's why it's tracking 22%.
That's right. But, I mean, in other years, an index fund might do worse. But over the long term, because an index fund and a managed fund, broadly, they're both tracking whether the economy is prosperous anyway. One involves active decision making and therefore a decision maker who you're paying for, and one doesn't. So if that's certainly the case if you've got a balanced account, so to speak. A balanced account is trying to measure broadly, it's spreading risk in a way that kind of tracks across the economy, where across different sectors in safe investments. So if the economy is doing well, those safe investments are doing well. If it's an index fund, well, it's just tracking the economy anyway. Without active.
So for anyone who heard that and went like, man, I'm gonna move my money to a Vanguard fund, seek your financial consultant first.
Don't take us. This is not financial advice.
This is
your own circumstances. Blah 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 blah.
Yeah, exactly. This was just me googling and finding out what the Vanguard fund fee year to date was, and it was 22%. So keep in mind that's just for right now. That is at the time of recording. It will definitely change tomorrow because tomorrow is a trading day. It'll probably change when you create your fund. So don't go by that.
The comparisons that matter are year over year over year, day over day.
Yeah.
All right.
So just to give you an idea, 10 years was at 10 years is at 8%. So it's not necessarily.
It's pretty close to 7% or 9%. But and that's the thing. The question is, do the fees of managed funds make up or exceed? Do they subtract that 1% difference if you're in an industry super fund getting your 9% return? Is that are the fees that you're paying enough to make that less than the 8% return from an index fund? And if your fund account balance is small enough, then the answer is yes.
Yeah.
And if those advice fees go up as your account balance goes up, then the answer may keep being yes, depending on your circumstances.
I might actually put as just as an addendum to the show notes. I listened to a very interesting Planet Money episode which talked about Warren Buffett versus an index fund. Like basically compared the results, and it was quite an interesting episode because it talks about these issues. So
why did Warren Buffett make a shit ton more than the index fund?
I think if I recall correctly, Warren Buffett did in fact beat the index fund. That was over. I think it was basically from like the end of the GFC through to like 2015 or something, like 2013 or something. It was like a 5-year period just after the GFC crashed, and so yeah, it was a very interesting episode. I'll post it. We won't discuss any further because we need to wrap up. But yeah, I'll put that in the show notes, and you can have a listen.
But anyway, but in all seriousness, super is a fantastic thing for the wealthy, right? It's just not that great for poor people, and I think despite the fact that they build it as something that helps poor people, it really doesn't. It really doesn't account for their circumstances. It's far too bureaucratic. Yeah. And all around, it just takes money from them without them.
It's a wealth transfer from the poor to financial advice and funds managers. So that sounds socially equitable to me.
Yeah. All right.
I've always been talking about how our banking industry is so desperately poor and in need of more money.
I get sick of bank CEOs panhandling on the street corner when I walk past them in the morning. I just feel so bad for them. With them with their bit of cardboard and their hats, and it's so unfortunate. All right, and on that devastating news of CEOs going poor, we'll finish the show. Thanks everybody for joining us. We will be back again next week.